welcome to episode 400 of the Postal Hub podcast. I'm Ian Kerr. In a moment, Assistant Professor Heleen Buldeo Rai joins me to discuss e-commerce returns and sustainability. But first of all, being a milestone episode, and since e-commerce returns is the subject of our feature interview, I want to, rant about a particular topic again. Now, 12 months ago, when Europe wasn't on fire, I talked about how the delivery sector is trying to reduce emissions while the broader e-commerce ecosystem seems to be basically, working against us, right? We're optimising delivery routes. Like I said, we're replacing diesel vans with electric vehicles, cargo bikes, walking routes. Maybe I'm just being a bit cynical today, but as I said a year ago, we're treating the symptoms, not the cause. Now, when you listen to this interview today with Heleen Buldeo Rai, you will understand exactly what I'm talking about. It builds upon a whole heap of other things we've been reading about over the last couple of years, especially when it comes to things like the amount of e-commerce that's returned. Now, that's just the stuff that's returned. We don't know how much stuff is just going straight into landfill or is being destroyed on the orders of an e-commerce platform. So I've said previously some returns might be legitimate, but there's got to be loads of it out there. Loads of returns which are bracketing, loads of returns which are wardrobing, and as I said, without even going into the unseen, not unreported, but difficult to measure problem of what goes straight into landfill. And you all know exactly what I mean. People who will order 3 items off a certain marketplace in the hope that one of them will work and the other 2 just get chucked into landfill. We're transporting that. We're trying to reduce our emissions, but for what? For a futile purchase. It seems daft, doesn't it? So I said last year, there has to be some sort of reckoning. Now, we've seen, since I recorded my rant a year ago, a lot of things have happened, not because of my rant, obviously, but things like the customs charges in the EU, removal of de minimis in various parts of the world. These sorts of things may make a difference to the amount of unnecessary purchases. They might just raise the price of those unnecessary purchases and not actually slow their consumption and therefore delivery through our delivery networks. But as I said a year ago, there has to be some sort of reckoning. There has to be. E-commerce is broken. It is still broken. It is not the fault of free delivery alone. There are a lot of things to do with e-commerce that lead to us being in this situation where we in the delivery sector are busting our proverbials to be green when the whole system needs to be reviewed. Anyway, enough of that. Something for us to all think about. Now that my rant is over, let's hear from an expert, Assistant Professor Heleen Buldeo Rai, on e-commerce returns and sustainability. Joining me on the line is Assistant Professor Heleen Buldeo Rai from VUB Mobilise Research Group. Heleen, it's great to have you back on the Postal Hub podcast. You and the team have recently published some research. Now, the very catchy title is Consumer Heterogeneity Behind E-commerce Returns and Emissions. We're talking about the behaviour of people who frequently return e-commerce purchases and what it means for the planet. Is that it in a sentence?
Very much so, yes.
All right, so before we get into that, can you just quickly give us an update? What are the current trends that you're seeing and that the research is showing when it comes to e-commerce returns?
Yeah, so in the last years, we've seen increasing purchases made online by consumers and also increasing shares of returns. So it's hard to put very exact numbers on it, and they differ a little bit from country to country and also from product category to category. But we know that one of the product categories that is bought most online, clothing, that there we see very high return percentages. 20% to even 50% of more of what is ordered online in that category is sent back to the retailer.
Those are really big figures though, aren't they? Is that, I'm going off script already here, Heleen, but are we seeing a higher rate of return in online commerce compared to, say, the retail fashion stores?
Oh yeah, definitely. It's only a few percentages, let's say 5 to 10% is what we see in academic research that is returned to a store, while online purchases are returned 15, 20 and plus percentages. So it goes way higher.
Well, let's talk then about serial returners, so people who are frequently returning purchased items. I mean, it's been in the news a number of times over the years with some of the retailers like ASOS or Amazon trying to crack down on serial returners. So first of all, how can we define a serial returner?
Yeah, so indeed, Ian, we've been seeing that quite some reports of retailers trying to focus specifically on these so-called serial returners. And we would define them as people who return excessively. But of course, for the study, we needed to have a more precise definition, right? So how we define it here is that serial returners are people who return at least half of what they buy online and send it back to the retailer. So we've played around a little bit with the specific thresholds of how we want to define it and see whether our conclusions were still holding, but approximately half of what these consumers buy online is sent back, and that's when we define them as a serial returner.
That figure is just very difficult to digest, that people could be buying so much. I mean, I gather then we're not talking about someone who buys 2 products a month and returns 1. Is there a minimum threshold for like the number of purchases people are making in a year and then are still returning 50% of those purchases?
Yeah, so in the beginning, we didn't take that into account, but we did make some sensitivity analysis, is what it's called, and robustness analysis. So we did at one point reduce or leave out the consumers who only bought like a few items a year, and then focused our analysis on people who bought more and the serial returners part of it. But we actually always came to the same conclusions. But so in general, we would see that the serial returners and non-serial returners, average consumers, buy roughly the same number of items online. So the difference is not very much on what they buy, but very much on what they return.
Then let's just continue this about the serial returners. What are their motivations? What's causing them to return so many things?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we asked all respondents in our survey a bunch of questions, 20 statements specifically related to returns, and then some more general on e-commerce, delivery, sustainability, and so on. And so what we would expect is that the serial returners do not care about sustainability and know nothing about how to reduce your environmental impact. So that would be the assumption. What we found is that actually there's not a very big difference between the consumers that we define as serial returners and the regular returners, let's say, in the motivation to be sustainable, to be a sustainable consumer. So we didn't really find a big difference there. What we did find is that those who are not considered serial returners, they're a lot more aware of how to be a more sustainable consumer. So they have this awareness and they have this knowledge, which a serial returners seem to lack. But then the biggest difference between those two groups and then what sets the serial returners apart is the fact that they're very much focused on convenience and using returns and lenient free returns specifically as a way to make their life easier, more convenient. And so that leads to some of these behaviors that we know of within the retail industry and that we are not necessarily loving from a sustainability point of view. Behavior like bracketing, ordering the same item in multiple sizes, wardrobing, ordering something, using it, could be a piece of clothing or even a television to see a specific game, and then sending it back as a return. So we see that these serial returners are a lot more prone to do that.
So have we created the conditions that allow serial returners to exist? Does the delivery, not the delivery sector, I mean, it's the e-commerce sector that's enabled free delivery and free returns. Does the e-commerce sector itself have to take responsibility for that?
Yeah, I think so. I think so, at least in part. There's, of course, a lot of retailers that are trying to compete in this space, but there's only a few that are really, really large and kind of setting the standards. So I don't want to blame each and every retailer, but I do think the retail sector in large has kind of encouraged this kind of behavior, not only specifically with the return policies that are in general quite generous for your returns, which is in line with European legislation, but also very long periods of time that you can return conditions that are very flexible with. right? Items that are clearly used are sometimes still refunded. And we know this, right? We've seen documentaries about these examples of this. But it's also in the messaging, the right to change your mind. You have the option to have a fitting room at home. This kind of messaging, of course, does not help in creating a more responsible consumer behavior, let's say.
We've talked a lot about how the e-commerce sector might be able to make descriptions of items better, or perhaps virtual fitting rooms to allow people to try things on virtually rather than in real life, so to speak. But we're still here talking about serial returners and the cost of it. We know we can probably measure the cost, because the cost it's in part posting it back. You've mentioned that items might not always be resaleable either. Just I know a question without notice here, Heleen. Are there any figures available about how much stock that gets returned can actually be resold? I mean, does it vary a lot by category? You mentioned the TV that might have watched their team lose the Champions League final and then they return it, as opposed to a pair of shoes that might have been worn once, or a dress that got worn to a ball. What are we seeing there?
Yeah, also here, there's a lot of speculation, a lot that we don't know, and a lot of retailers pointing to one another in reports and studies on this. And of course, we're also seeing there European legislation. There's one study that I found and that I referenced in our study as well that points to retailer practices of what happens when products are returned. Are they sold back, and which share of cases are they actually being able to be sold back? Because that depends, of course, on whether the item is still interesting to be sold. It might have taken too long, or the quality might have deteriorated in the process of returning it. And so for retailers who adopt what these researchers call responsible strategies or sustainable strategies, it's almost 80%, if I remember correctly, of items that are still resold after a return. And so for retailers who do not adopt these practices, it's lower. So that gives you an indication of the resale potential of returned items.
And there's a lot to understand when it comes to returns, isn't there? I mean, it's not just the item gets returned to the retailer who then puts it back in their warehouse. They might decide that, like you said, it's no longer sellable because it's out of fashion, in which case it might go to a tertiary market, and it might end up being sold in a market square somewhere in Europe or wherever. You just don't know where it's going to end up. And those could be, it's not always knockoffs that you're buying at those stores. It could be legitimate products that's just found its way through that channel. Anyway, let's not disappear down that rabbit hole right now. Let's return to the topic of returns, and in particular, the sustainability implications of returns. We have talked about this in the industry a bit. How can we make e-commerce returns more sustainable? So what are the sustainability implications of returns in general? And what can you share with us when it comes to the sustainability implications of serial return behavior?
Yeah, so every return needs to go back to the retailer. So there's the whole transport chain that needs to at least double. It's often a lot less efficient than than delivery activities that are planned as well as possible and that can be forecasted pretty neatly. With a return, that's not necessarily the case. And also what we know, especially with large retailers, they might have a lot of distribution centers and they have dedicated return centers, but less so. And so that means that the distances that these returns have to cover are a lot higher. And so that's why we see quite a high estimation of environmental impacts that are associated. And of course, every return costs money to a retailer as well. So from an economic point of view, it's also very uninteresting. And so when we look at it from the perspective of our consumer behavior and specifically our serial returners, we found that on average, these serial return behaviors return 15 items a year compared to regular consumers, non-serial returners, who return only 2 items a year. So there's a very big difference. But what surprised us as well is that this group of serial returners is actually quite small. Our study was focused on 10 European countries, so we have quite a spread in Europe. All the samples for each country are also representative for a number of metrics, let's say age, gender, and so on. And so what we found there is that even though this serial return group is quite low, on average 15%, they are responsible for almost 60% of the CO2 emissions associated with the returns of all the respondents that we surveyed in this large survey. So 15% of consumers responsible for almost 60% of CO2 emissions. That's huge, right? And I think that gives retailers the permission, let's say, or maybe the encouragement of focusing on specifically these consumers when they really want to reduce their environmental impact and also the economic impacts of returns.
Heleen, we've given people a bit of an overview of some of the topics that you really go into depth in your research paper. I'm just going to look up the name of it again. It's called Consumer it's my native tongue, everybody. Consumer Heterogeneity Behind E-commerce Returns and Emissions. It's really interesting stuff, and anybody involved in e-commerce returns should read it. If people want to find out more about the research that you do at VUB Mobilise and all that, where should they go?
They can go to my LinkedIn page and also the webpage of our research group Mobilise at VUB Brussels.
I'll stick a link to Heleen's LinkedIn page and to the relevant page on the VUB Mobilise research page so that you can get in contact, download the research, find out more, pepper Heleen with more questions because we've really only scratched the surface on this topic. And it's something, in my humble opinion, that we need to talk more about. The impact of e-commerce shopper behaviour in purchasing and in returning products cross-border and all that. But I've got to stop here, Heleen, otherwise I'm going to start lecturing and people will stop listening. Assistant Professor Heleen Buldeo Rai from VUB Mobilise Research Group, thank you very much for joining us on the Postal Hub podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
Coming soon on the Postal Hub podcast, Dominic Mumcars. He's the Director of Sustainability at GeoPost. And many more great interviewees, guests, experts will be joining me on the podcast in the coming weeks and months. Don't miss a single episode. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast in your favourite podcast platform. Google Podcasts. Oh, Google Podcasts doesn't exist anymore, does it? Oh, well then subscribe in the other ones. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and various other ones, I'm sure. Oh, YouTube, apparently. Anyway, subscribe, please. Leave a rating, 5 out of 5, 10 out of 10, whatever your platform supports. Leave a review that says how wonderful the podcast is as well, please. If you want to see more of my stuff in your feed or in your inbox, you can subscribe to the Daily Delivery Digest. It's delivered direct to your inbox every weekday. There's the Post Office Digest, which is a monthly digest of all the post office news, so retail, postal stuff, all of that. Go to thepostalhub.com and follow the links. And if you can't work it out, email me. My email address is ian@thepostalhub.com. I'm Ian Kerr. Thanks for listening in, and I look forward to your company next time on the Postal Hub podcast.